Hi, I'm Sharon Shewmake from the 42nd Legislative District. And if you haven't noticed, we are in a housing crisis. For every 10 new households that have formed in the last 10 or so years, we've only built 7 new homes. When that happens, the prices get bid up and you end up with an equilibrium where the price of the home is what the 7th wealthiest person can just barely afford. And this was before the COVID pandemic, which means that before it was about land costs, but now we also have those higher building costs that are starting to soar, making it even more difficult. So hopefully our supply chain sorts out building costs, but the solution to the cost of housing from land costs is either to open up more land or economize on land by building denser. We can make investments in the housing trust fund, getting tax incentives right with things like the multifamily tax exemption, but also cutting red tape that we see especially around more modest types of housing like accessory dwelling units, sometimes they're called garden colleges, or ADUs. This is pretty standard economic theory that building more supply can reduce prices, but it's also borne out by evidence. When California did ADU reform, they were permitting about 1,000 ADUs per year statewide. Afterwards, it was over 12,000 ADUs statewide per year. That's amazing. When we look at Vancouver, it's a smaller number, but they also saw about a 12-fold increase in ADUs permitted each year. And in Vancouver, BC, which has had this policy for a lot longer, 1 in 3 single-family homes has an ADU. If Seattle were to do that, that would add 47,000 housing units just to Seattle. So changing policy can get us more ADUs. We saw states, we saw cities do that. You may not see a decrease in housing prices immediately, but again, you have to compare that to the counterfactual. It would have been worse if we hadn't built all these units. And we do see cities with less restrictive zoning policy have more affordable housing. So I don't want to live in Houston, which is a city famous for no zoning. But gosh, if you look at what the price of a house in Houston is downtown, you can get it for about $300,000. And again, that's because they just build so much and there's so much more building and there just aren't as many restrictions around that building. Our obligation, again, my obligation is to the people of the state. So when we look at statewide ADU reform, when we look at making sure that we're cutting that red tape at a state level, sometimes cities don't really like that. They want to be able to do their individual piece. But the reason that it's important to do it statewide is when an individual city is creating a lot of jobs, that's great. We love that. But when there's not enough housing, people move from that city to the neighboring communities. And so that city can actually end up exporting its housing affordability crisis all along their communities, all up and down I-5. And we really have seen that, which again comes back to this need for a coordinated response that builds affordability and diversity of housing in all communities. This diversity of housing is really important for social cohesion. It's really important for equity. It's really important for reducing the impacts of climate change and congestion, but it's also important for kids. So, I'm an economist, which means that I read a lot of other economists. And one of my favorites is Roz Chetty at Harvard. And he has some great research showing that when a family gets a housing voucher to move to a middle or a high income neighborhood, it's good for the kids. They do better in school, parents are less stressed, and it's just a net win. And so when we segregate our housing by saying only houses of a certain type can be here and more modest housing over here, we don't get that interplay. We don't get those benefits for kids. So people like ADUs, you'll hear that from even people who don't like this bill. And my main pitch is that statewide ADU reform is needed if we want to truly address this affordability crisis. Right now, the bill is in the Senate, it's in the Housing Committee, and then once it goes to the Housing Committee, it goes to the Rules Committee and goes to the Senate floor. Please email me, tell me your thoughts on housing, on how to address housing affordability. I know ADUs aren't the only piece that we need to do reform statewide, but they're the piece that I think we can do today, and we'll continue this work in session after session after session.